science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker to advance the frontier of architectural thinking. And today I am speaking with Joseph Clarke and we are discussing his book Echoes Chamber, Architecture and the Idea of Acoustic Space. It is a great conversation. We go down a journey on acoustics, acoustical space, and acoustical thinking. It has all kinds of ramifications. We discuss war, aesthetics, beauty, and the ineffable. Our heroes are Richard Wagner and Le Corbusier, and much discussion is deeply personal to both of us. But I hope you will enjoy it too. Here we go. Okay, well, welcome, Joseph. Welcome to Architecture Talk, and thank you for talking to me and sharing your new book with me. So, by the way, congratulations. Echoes Chamber, Architecture and the Idea of Acoustic Space, just published by University of Pittsburgh Press. And it says here boldly, architectural history, even though you're in an art history program at the University of Toronto. So we won't hold that against you. I'm very excited to have this book in my hand. And it's a beautifully produced and well-written book, very well researched, a lot of archival work in there. And besides the introduction, it has 5 chapters, which it seems to me begin roughly in the 18th century and kind of move forward into basically end with Corbusier, as a lot of things seem to lead up to and revolve around. So I'm very intrigued by this because one of the things is, I've just finished writing a monograph on my father's work on Aditya Prakash, and he was also deeply interested in acoustics. And I very briefly, towards the end of the book, try and produce a reading of acoustics as a spatial and form generating concept, as other to the scopic or the eye-centric worldview of post-colonial India. So I'm very intrigued, and I thank you for doing an extensive research on this. So why don't we start by you introducing us some of the basic concepts? Maybe you want to tell us about what do you mean by your main title, Echoes Chamber. What is this? What is the concept behind this title, and what is the idea of acoustic space that you are exploring in here?
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm, what did they say? I'm a long-time listener, first-time guest. So I really appreciate being able to be on the program and talk with you about the work that I've been doing now for, I guess, about 10 years in one form or another. Yeah, so maybe I should start by telling you how I got to this project and where I came from. I actually grew up in the Midwestern United States, and when I was a child, I sang in choirs in my school and at church.
Of course.
And so I always had a sort of musical exposure to music in my life. And then when I went to architecture school, I was, on the one hand, I was actually really intrigued to discover that so many of my classmates, probably 50% of the class, had some kind of musical background, playing an instrument or being in a band or whatever it might be.
All right.
And this in a way, this seemed intuitively, it made perfect sense to me, because architecture for me, with its combination of kind of mathematical, formal issues and also artistic and cultural dimension, seemed to kind of resonate with both halves of my brain in the same way that music did. But on the other hand, so much of what we do in architecture school is visual, and I learned to design by drawing and by looking at images. I learned architectural history through images. And so this was a real kind of question for me, why we seem to kind of marginalize this whole dimension of the physical environment that I would have thought, and I think to a lot of ordinary people who aren't trained in architecture, believe is really crucial to the success or failure of a building, to the way that we experience a building. And yet, for somewhere along the line in architectural training, I think we kind of lose our ability to understand acoustics. For most architects, in my experience, acoustics is sort of cloaked in mystery. It's this field that the only way we could really engage it in a rigorous way is through equations, which are so complex that most of us architects, we need an engineer to come in and solve them for us.
That's right. It's a consultant's job, not really a design job. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So the question for me was to think about how this state of affairs came about, and what, if there was a history to architects' efforts to conceptualize sound as an architectural problem.
So answer that first part for us first. Why are we so scopically dominated and not acoustically in the modern regime?
Well, the media that we use to design and the media that we use to study architecture are visual. I think it's as simple as that.
Why did it come about that way? I mean, what were the biases at play in the rise of professionalism, let's just say, that enforced that? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think a lot of the narratives that we have go back to the early modern period, to the rise of printing, books, to the development of modern drawing techniques and techniques of projection, that establish architectural expertise as an expertise manipulating images. And this is how we learn to design. This is how I teach architectural history. And of course, I teach it by showing my students pictures of buildings that many of which they may never have a chance to visit in their lives, but they learn what they look like.
Right.
And we assume that means they've learned about the building. So our discipline is completely about images. Most architects don't produce buildings. They produce drawings of buildings.
That's right.
That somebody else will go and possibly go and build. So our discipline, it's visual through and through. And it has been for hundreds of years.
Yeah. So, okay, so go on. So echoes chambers. So you are writing about the other history of our discipline, those who look at architecture through sound.
Yes, that's right. So in some ways, this is kind of the secret history of the minority of architects. Admittedly, it's a minority of Western architects, I should say, who have tried to, and with varying degrees of success. And some of them, I have to say, didn't succeed, but we can still learn a lot from them. We can learn from failure. And some of them did succeed in trying to make sense of sound spatially. The book, I sort of frame it in terms of Marshall McLuhan, the great the great Canadian media philosopher who actually coined the term acoustic space. And this was one of his key words that he repeated over and over and over again, to describe how he envisioned that. And of course, this has been subject to so many critiques. But his argument was that Western culture, at least since the Renaissance, had been primarily structured around visual space, that the way that we communicate, the way that we orient ourselves in the world had been primarily visual. And that was based on the predominance of printed books, images, the linear perspective, newspapers, and so forth. In the starting in the 20th century with the rise of radio, this was for him the defining transition. The rise of radio really made modern mass media and politics possible. And this had changed everything for him, because suddenly people were beginning to communicate, to understand their relationship to society and to one another in terms of acoustic media. And for him, this reflected a like profound transition in the nature of our senses and in the nature of our society. It was connected to the demand for more interactive and participatory kinds of media. And we can think today of social media. It was connected to the sense that the world had shrunk, that every place was not that far from every other place.
Right.
We're all, suddenly we feel like we're all connected all the time.
So what did he mean specifically by acoustic space? What was his, in a sense, definition, McLuhan's?
Well, he provided about 100 different definitions. And the problem with McLuhan is that he would try to relate every possible phenomenon of the contemporary world back to acoustic space, sometimes in untenable ways. But he was trying to connect, and I think in a pretty profound way, the way that our senses work and our auditory sensation with some of the most profound problems that we face in the contemporary world, how we communicate with one another, how we learn to listen to one another. For McLuhan, the condition of acoustic space was also characterized by political tribalism, and this is something that I think resonates with us all today. For him, it was as though we were all humans are living in a single room, in a single enormous interior environment in which everybody can hear everybody else. And
so the Twitter sphere is still a part of McLuhan acoustic space, would you argue?
Yes, he was writing about this 50 years ago. Yeah.
Right.
And this is a new condition that's exhilarating, and it's also terrifying if we don't learn how to adapt to it.
Right.
And so,
but you have a different title for this, right? I mean, you're calling it echoes chamber. What's the difference between acoustic space and an echoes chamber?
An echo chamber is both a room where we hear everything. We have this sort of deafening sound of our own voices and of everybody's voices simultaneously. And Echo is also a mythological figure. So I actually go back to Ovid's Metamorphoses, and Echo, the nymph, who is condemned by the goddess Juno to simply repeat what other people say. And so Echo as a phenomenon that philosophers and writers have speculated about for hundreds of years, but that has also been an inspiration for architects at least since the Enlightenment.
Right. Okay. So, you spend a fair amount of time on the 18th and 19th century and, dealing with the complexities of how to represent acoustic qualities and the debates and discussions around, whether or not sound can be represented in the same way that light can be represented through reflective surfaces and so on and so forth. One part of your book seems to crystallize around the question of the design of the auditorium, and in particular, Richard Wagner's attempt to make a complete work of art, Gesamtkunstwerk, with the design of his theaters in Germany, and his idea that a Volk could be connected to the nation, or the people could be connected to the nation, and the idea of the nation, I think, can be precipitated via the production of a Gesamtkunstwerk, right, or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of the theater in kind of Wagner's view of things?
Yes, absolutely. I do spend a lot of time in this book writing about theaters and opera houses and other kinds of auditoria, not because I wanted to write a kind of typological history of the theater building, but simply because these are the buildings that in the 18th and 19th centuries, clients really cared about acoustics and would be willing to spend money for the architect to undertake the kind of acoustic research, to think about sound as an architectural problem. But yes, I mean, in many ways, this culminates in the theater that the composer Richard Wagner built in Bayreuth, Germany, in Bavaria in the 1870s for the staging of his operas. And this was a really significant building for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, just the very fact that a composer was creating a building for his own works. I mean, Wagner was, among other things, not only a composer, but a great entrepreneur and businessman and expert in branding to figure out how to raise the money to build this thing, only for the production of his own site-specific operas, which were only meant to be performed, at least his final work, Parsifal, was meant to be only performed in this one theater. So that's remarkable. And it is a very innovative building that actually draws on a whole long discourse of European theater architecture that we can go back to the 18th century. We could look at Ledoux's theater in Besançon, Schinkel's theaters in Berlin, and Gottfried Semper's various designs for theaters. And this all fed in to and also the Paris Opera, which was for much of the 19th century the kind of center of innovative theater design and theatrical spectacle. So all of this fed into Wagner's theater design. But weirdly, and this theater in Bavaria still exists, and you can go and see it. Weirdly, architectural historians have kind of not registered that this is a central site of modern culture, where a new kind of mass spectacle was produced for the first time. A lot of writers in film and media studies are obsessed with Wagner's theater because of its innovative architecture, and architectural historians haven't really caught up. So what I try to do is talk about the history of the theater, and specifically its acoustic conception. And in fact, the architect who designed it, who's this totally obscure, completely forgotten architect named Otto Bruchwald, was actually an acoustic expert. And that's the reason that Wagner brought him on to design this project. So it's a theater designed not so much around vision, but around listening.
Yeah, and you note that Wagner originally worked with Semper, and Gottfried Semper was his architect, but then he dropped him and moved on to this other architect because he felt that he could work more directly with him to produce this complete work.
Yeah, it was partly that Bruchwald was more malleable than Semper. Semper had strong ideas, and Semper was a real artist. He was an artist and a theorist and a thinker, and he had his vision for what a great theater should be. And Wagner had an enormous ego of his own, and he had his idea of what a theater should be. It was the classic story of clashing egos. And
so let's dive a little bit deeper into Wagner's vision. I mean, what was the vision, and why was this theater in this particular way so important for him?
Well, it did have something to do with, as you mentioned before, with nationalism.
Right.
So over the course of the 19th century, for most of the century, Germany was not one country. As we know, it was a bunch of smaller countries, which were struggling to unify. And there was a nationalist movement that the German Romantics had been part of, trying to kind of build a unified culture. And Schiller actually said that when Germany has a theater culture, a national theater culture of its own, then it will truly become a nation. And so Wagner was part of this movement to create a literary and musical culture for Germany that could sort of bring the German nation into being. Now, by the time that he actually managed to build his theater, the German nation had already come into being, and not through this nice story of the development of culture, but through war, through the Prussian victory over the French in 1871. But a big part of what Wagner was trying to do was to create a German national culture, which was a very progressive goal in the context of the 19th century. When we talk about nationalism, I think that it has a different valence. And of course, we're looking back through the history of the Second World War and Nazism. But in the 19th century, this was actually the progressive political position to support a unified nation.
So
but
is there a sort of continuity there between the unity of all the arts and the unity of the nation? I mean, is that a kind of a homology he was trying to produce, or how was this supposed to work?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is, because he writes about his idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk the total work of art, as though the arts are people, are sisters who come together and work together for a common purpose. So I think that was an implicit analogy.
Implicit or explicit?
Well, I don't know. I think we can go back to his writings and see. I don't think he spelled it out quite that explicitly, but I definitely think that it's there. But what's interesting is how over the course of his career, his development as a composer, and over the course of his experiences in German society, and he was actually involved, along with Semper, he was involved in the failed revolutions of 1848 and 1849. They were both living in Dresden, where Wagner was the conductor of the orchestra, and they participated in this uprising that didn't succeed. And so then they were both exiled. And so this is when Semper went to London and was involved in the Great Exhibition in London. Wagner was exiled, and he lived in Switzerland for a while. And his view of this total work of art began to change, and he became more drawn to the philosophy of Schopenhauer, moving away from from Hegel's idealist philosophy and more into the philosophy of Schopenhauer, which was often seen as a more pessimistic philosophy, at least pessimistic towards the possibility of political transformation through culture. His style of composing began to change also, and the sound of his music became more important to the way that his operas or his music dramas were conceived. Wagner was also really interested in the production of new timbres or new sounds, not simply through the traditional European musical means of melody and harmony, these conventional categories, but even inventing new kinds of instruments that would produce different sounds. So Wagner was a great admirer of Adolphe Sax, who was the instrument maker in Paris, who was inventing new instruments, and Wagner developed some new instruments of his own. And so one of his motivations in building his own theater was to have a building where he could control every dimension of the production, but especially the sound and the acoustic quality of it.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because you spend a lot of time on the section, on the design of the orchestra pit, right? I mean, that seems to be an important innovation for Wagner, and at that time, why was that such an important thing?
Well, this has been one of the most celebrated aspects of Wagner's theater is the sunken orchestra pit. So when you're sitting in this theater watching a production, the orchestra is completely out of sight. You never see the musicians. In fact, I have a photograph I sometimes show of production where it's taken from an angle, so you can see the musicians in the orchestra and you can see the spectators in the audience, and the spectators are all dressed to the nines with the gowns and tuxedos, and the musicians are wearing t-shirts and shorts because they know that nobody's ever going to see them because they're completely invisible. Right. So what Wagner wanted to do, and this is very interesting, he wanted you to hear music and not be able to place where it was coming from. And so your attention would be entirely on the visual scene of the stage, and your brain would process the music that you were hearing simply as the background to the visual scene on stage. And so this is really like a forerunner of cinema and the way that films use music to, sometimes in a rather manipulative way, to make us feel emotions, to change the way that we perceive a scene. But when we're watching a movie, we don't always even notice the music consciously. It's there subliminally, changing our perception of the scene. So he was involved in this kind of trying to re-engineer our sensory perception, our audio-visual perception in a fundamental way.
Right. And later on, I'm not sure how much you worked on that, but, Corbusier also invents this idea of the, what's it called? The magic box, which is also kind of a acoustic chamber that it never built, but he had this idea of the magic box, which would be a kind of a sound device, sound theater performance space, which kind of disappears.
Corbusier was very influenced by Wagner initially as a young man. He actually read about Wagner. He was really into music when he was growing up. In fact, his mother was a piano teacher, and his brother was a musician.
The story goes that they always thought that Corbusier's brother, Albert, was the really cool kid because he was a
Yes.
musician, and Corbusier was this sort of lesser kid.
And they wanted Albert to be a concert violinist.
Yes,
and apparently they pushed him so hard to practice his violin that he actually injured his arm. And so he had to be, so he became a composer and a music teacher. And so Corbusier never had that musical training, but he kind of imbibed his interest in music as a young man. And he was very taken with Wagner, as a lot of Europeans were at that time. Around the turn of the century. When he was living in Vienna, he went to Wagner operas, and we have correspondence. He would write back home to his parents and just gush over the Wagnerian operas about these big emotions acted out on stage, and he was really into these productions. So that was a major influence on him.
Later on, he comes to Ronchamp, and of course his idea of acoustic and ineffable space and all that. But how are these acoustic ideas played out in Corbusier's early work between the wars, let's say?
So like in his purist period, he was very enthusiastic about communication technology and about the potential for architecture to contribute to the building of a new mass society and mass politics. So he did a number of designs for projects that involved acoustics, although they were almost all competition entries that were not selected in the end. So this is why they're not better known, but maybe the most famous one is his design for the Palace of the League of Nations in Geneva, which was in, I think, 1927, which features, of course, a huge hall for the delegates to meet in. And he and this was with his cousin Pierre Jeanneret. They argued that the reason the jury should pick their design was because they worked with an acoustic consultant. This was something very innovative, to bring in a trained engineer to consult about acoustics, and their design was completely designed around audibility and making the voices of the delegates audible without the need for electric amplification. Now, it's not clear that it actually would have worked, but this was their theory. And they actually did bring in an acoustician named Gustave Lyon, who actually also designed a concert hall in Paris during this period, which is sort of, if you compare the Corbusier League of Nations design and the Lyon concert hall, they look exactly the same. So it was the same basic principle. So he did that project, and they didn't win, but actually that was one of the reasons behind the formation of SIAM, the International Congress of Modern Architecture, which formed after that project was rejected because modernist architects around Europe were so irate that the jury had not picked Corbusier to design the League of Nations. So actually,
one of the things that occurs to me here again is, so there is Wagner trying to produce the idea of the nation through sound and a certain sort of acoustic experience. And now here is Corbusier trying to produce the idea of the supernation, if that's what the League of Nations is, right? With, again, a kind of an acoustic argument at its heart.
Exactly, yeah. So there's an idea that modern politics, modern diplomacy is acoustic in nature.
And I'm also thinking of the Mundaneum and the sort of Museum of Infinite Growth, which becomes the Museum of Knowledge later on, and we'll come to that, was supposed to be the idea that, we can quickly connecting people and having people talk to each other was considered to be a necessary part of producing the supernation, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's a kind of a secularized Tower of Babel idea, is it not?
Absolutely. And actually, Corbusier, in his writing about his League of Nations design, he compares it to the Tower of Babel, which you would think would be a negative example to compare it to. But he kind of embraces this. This is going to be the new Tower of Babel that's now built with the help of an engineer. And so this time we're going to get it right. We'll be able to bring all nations together, people speaking in different languages, but we'll all be able to understand each other, and we'll all be able to communicate. The production of the modern nation and modern international diplomacy is absolutely connected to acoustic media. And we should also say, famously, Albert Speer said that it was the radio and the loudspeaker that made the rise of Hitler possible.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
And Speer would be in a position to know, having designed the Nazi rally grounds in Nuremberg. So, so this is absolutely central to the construction of the nation.
Right. In a sense, through amplification and translation, the expectation is that the misunderstandings produced by the dispersal of languages, which were resulted because of the expulsion of the people, supposedly around the Babel, could be nullified by acoustics, right? I mean, if misunderstanding was the cause of war, then all you needed was good acoustics and good communication to solve the problem of war, which is an idea which hasn't gone away. Many people would think that, if you could just sit down and talk and clearly understand each other, everything would be okay.
Right. If we can fix our communication, I mean, we talk about communication problems as the source of the problem in our politics, in our interpersonal relationships. We need to communicate better. Yeah, we project all of our problems into communication.
Yeah, let's just sit and talk about it. Is the mantra. Yeah. But after the Second World War, Corbusier sort of transforms this acoustic character or acoustic idea of acoustic space into something a bit more quizzical or ineffable, particularly around his design of grand champ, does he not?
Yes, and the project that people know from Corbusier that involves acoustics is the Phillips Pavilion. So this is from 1958, right. Of course, the first World's Fair after World War II, relatively small pavilion for the Philips Electronics Company, but containing this kind of multimedia spectacle that was designed by Corbusier and in working along with the composer Edgar Varèse and Yannis Xenakis, who was both an architect and a composer. But actually, many of the ideas behind the Philips Pavilion, Corbusier actually developed a couple of years earlier for Ronchamp. And he wasn't able to fully implement them in that project for reasons we can talk about. And so they wound up in sort of migrating to the Philips Pavilion project instead. But yeah, so this is connected in partly with his mysterious text on acoustic space, this little essay that he wrote in the mid-40s about the aesthetic experience of architecture as a static event of kind of spiritual feeling of the consonance between a building and the site and the person experiencing it, which he describes in acoustic terms. It's almost as though the building is making a sound and it echoes through the landscape and comes back, and you perceive this consonance in that sound.
So it goes from this ultra technologized communication, therefore solve all the world's problems claim around the League of Nations and the Palace of the Soviets, into this something that's more ineffable and spiritual and kind of has almost mystical qualities, right? I mean, why? How did that happen? Why do you think that transformation took place in Corbusier's oeuvre?
It does seem like a dramatic transformation. I think in some ways, the seeds of this later idea were already there. If you look closely, there's the scholar Christopher Pearson wrote an article about this. If you actually look at some of his writings, even from the 20s and even earlier, where he mentions sound, for example, when he went to Greece to visit the Parthenon, in his diaries, he talks about seeing the Parthenon as having a kind of acoustic quality. He describes it to hearing the sound of a trumpet, and there's something about the relationship of the Parthenon and the Acropolis in this site in the landscape that it catalyzed a sort of aesthetic reaction that he suddenly had. So I don't think it was entirely new in the 1940s, but he definitely seems to have felt that by that point, that acoustics was no longer just purely a kind of technical engineering problem to be solved, but was trying to apply it in a different way to his formal conception of architecture. And this is something that some observers of Le Corbusier were really freaked out by.
Right.
James Sterling wrote that famous article about the Chapel of Ronchamp, really skeptical that this could be a direction for architecture. It seemed like Corbusier had kind of given up on some of the basic tenets of the modern project with this this building.
Yeah, rationalism in particular was something he came down upon. So let's move to the Phillips Pavilion now, which is also a brilliant, not brilliant, at least fascinating project. And amazing music of Edgar Varese, right?
Yes. Well, yeah, but this is what's interesting, that actually Corbusier wanted to bring Varese into the Ronchamp project.
He did.
So this is in fact where it started. Yes. So in Corbusier's designs for Ronchamp, and the project took about 5 years to design. So it was, for a long time, he was producing drawings and models of this chapel. Mm-hmm. If you look, you will see in many of these drawings this sort of metal grid structure that was to be built next to the chapel, next to the entrance of the chapel. Mm-hmm. And this was, Le Corbusier called this a campanile. So this was like a bell tower. It's mm-hmm. not actually a tower, but conceptually that was its function. And he would have loudspeakers mounted on this grid mm-hmm. and this kind of framework, and they would play experimental music at different times of the day. Uh-huh. And this would be his modern interpretation of bells. In fact, originally he wanted to have just the recorded sounds of bells.
Right.
But then he seems to have gotten more ambitious, and he wanted to bring a composer in. He wrote a letter to Edgar Varese and invited him to participate in the project, and described the kind of music that he wanted Varese to create for Ronchamp. He said it could juxtapose liturgical music of the past with modern sounds that would be violent and impersonal. So he seems to have had in mind this kind of like sonic montage of traditional church music and jarring, violent new sounds that would produce a kind of what we would now call sound art. I mean, that term didn't exist then, but it would be the sound installation that would completely transform the way you experience this chapel. So now, we go to Ronchamp, we make as architects, we make our pilgrimage to Ronchamp, and uh-huh. it's quiet, and we sort of meditate in this contemplative silence. Sure. But that's not actually what he wanted at all. And that's what's so fascinating.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Yeah.
So they didn't build that.
Yeah. Why didn't they build it? Why did?
The best answer is that the Vatican cracked down on this project by the French Dominicans to introduce more modern art and modern music into the Catholic Church. So it was these very progressive French Dominicans who had invited Corbusier to design the project in the first place, but they were the Pope kind of had his eye on them and was trying to hold them in check. And as the Ronchamp project went along, the Pope was continuing to crack down further, and eventually the chapel was built, but they had to scale back some of the other ambitions.
Now, but in La Tourette, Corbusier put this huge, dramatically placed bell on top of the chapel, right? I mean, that does have a big bell, doesn't it?
It does. And originally he wanted to have an enormous loudspeaker on top of the church that would play some kind of avant-garde sound. I'm not sure whether it was to play the sound of like monks chanting or what it would be.
Imagine Edgar Varese going over the landscape of La Tourette.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be
crazy?
Insane? Yeah.
Yeah.
With all this.
And I mean, if you think about it, this was the same period roughly when John Cage was doing his pieces, 4 minutes and 33 seconds.
Yeah.
This was the period when European composers, Varese, but also Stockhausen was coming on the scene and beginning to think about designing a concert spatially to have sound coming from multiple locations. Xenakis, who was actually an architect working in Le Corbusier's office at the time, but then after that left to become a composer, was also starting to think spatially about composing music. So Le Corbusier was on the edge of something. He was on the cutting edge, and
that stuff is still cutting edge, man. I mean, you listen to Varese or Xenakis, it's still out there.
It is way out there. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about the Brussels Pavilion. Now, Xenakis basically designed it. It was supposed to be like a stomach. So is Xenakis like a final realization of this acoustic vision?
Yeah, in some ways you could say that. I mean, I think Le Corbusier and Xenakis also had, shall we say, creative differences. And this is why right after that project, Corbusier fired Xenakis. Basically, they felt that they couldn't work together anymore. But yeah, in many ways, I mean, Xenakis was finally able to realize some of these ambitions that Corbusier had. You know, what's also interesting about the Philips Pavilion is the client, Philips. So this was an electronics company. It still is a company that makes audio equipment. They, in addition to making radios and microphones, they were also in the mid-20th century, they were also starting to design systems for modifying the acoustics of architectural spaces. Mm-hmm. So particularly concert halls and auditoria that had acoustic problems. They would install systems of hidden microphones and loudspeakers that could change the acoustics of the space in real time. So for example, if the hall didn't have enough reverberation, you could install this system. It was very cutting edge, and it would simulate more reverberation, but it would sound just like natural, like it was coming from the building. Mm-hmm. They installed this system at La Scala, the famous opera house in Milan. So this was their great triumph. But the problem with it was that when the system was working well, you didn't notice it. And especially La Scala didn't want to publicize that they had installed this electronic system, because this the whole mythos of the perfect acoustics of their opera house would be ruined. Right. So Philips had developed this amazing technology and didn't have any way really to publicize it. And so that's why they wanted to create a World's Fair Pavilion where they could show off their audio technology and specifically their ability to alter the acoustics of a room. And so this was the point this was the intention with the Philips Pavilion, to have a space where they could showcase their acoustic equipment.
So the Philips Pavilion was designed to I know it had speakers everywhere, right? It was completely black, and there were all these weird Corbusier images moving across the surface, and the surfaces were bent in every direction. So it must have been, what was it, 8.5 minute experience, right? That you went in and out of the stomach of Philips Pavilion. So what was the experience supposed to engender in the viewer? Do you have a sense?
Well, Le Corbusier came up with the idea that it would be a stomach. So he developed the initial stomach-shaped plan, and then he sort of handed that off to Xenakis to work out the actual form with these hyperbolic paraboloids.
Right.
But if we take the metaphor seriously, then you were supposed to be digested. You were supposed to be ingested into this building. And what happens in the stomach? You sort of were churned around in these juices that break you down. And then send you out the other side. So Corbusier was, I think, less interested in the architectural design of the pavilion, because he was happy to he was busy with Chandigarh at this point. So he was happy to let Xenakis, work out the building form. But he was very interested in the images and this audiovisual program of the pavilion. So he picked out from his archive of images, which was vast, a kind of sequence of images that he composed, poetically to tell. I think it's a sort of narrative of the story of humanity.
Yeah, with the Corbusier coming out,
which culminates, of course, in
Chandigarh.
And this yes, the story culminates in Le Corbusier's buildings and his
Of
designs
course,
for
of
cities,
course.
and then he brought in Edgar Varèse to finally got the chance to collaborate with him. He had met Varèse decades earlier and was really fascinated with his music and thought that he was the most visionary composer, and had been wanting a chance for the two of them to work together. And so finally it happened, and Varèse composed this music that actually sounds a lot like Corbusier's description of what he wanted the Ronchamp installation to sound like, with kind of it's a sort of collage of sort of snippets of older Western music and bells and chanting with the sound of a jet engine and other kinds of modern synthesized noises.
Right. So as we move to the end over here, last question, the thought that occurs to me, the Brussels Pavilion, in a sense, was Corbusier's Bayreuth. His Gesamtkunstwerk, right? I mean, it was his operatic moment. Is that a reasonable, is that like, that's what Wagner did with Zempa and his architect. And this is me with my Varèse doing my 1950s version of it. They're about 100 years apart, aren't they?
Yeah, well, absolutely. But they had probably similarly sized egos.
Of course.
But I think it is a Gesamtkunstwerk. But the difference is that Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk was really his total vision. I mean, he wanted to control every dimension of the production. He did control every dimension of it, and he wanted every dimension of it to fit together and complement one another basically seamlessly. So it's almost impossible to tell where the music ends and the set design begins, and where the dramatic text, the libretto ends, and the costumes begin. With Corbusier, it's a bit different because he was more comfortable with, he had sort of internalized the critique of Wagner that was already part of European culture by this point. And he was more comfortable with the different dimensions, the different tracks of the production, if you will, the audio and the visual, being more in tension with one another. Right. And so he and plus he was not a composer himself, and he understood this. Although he loved music, he didn't know how to compose.
Right.
So he was comfortable working with Varèse and giving Varèse a pretty high level of autonomy.
Right.
And in fact, apparently, I don't know whether this is true, but he says that he and Varèse, they agreed on the total length of the so-called poème électronique, but they didn't coordinate it at all. And so it was just fortuitously. So if the images and the sound seem to kind of link up at certain points, that's totally coincidental.
Right.
We're told.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's, you can think of the opera theater also as like being inside a stomach. And then you sort of pass through. It's like stomach to stomach. And I remember Corbusier referred to the assembly halls, the actual chambers in the Chandigarh assembly building that has two chambers, as stomachs.
Really?
Yes, he calls them stomachs.
Well, there are connections between those projects, because he also brought on one of the Philips engineers that he worked with for the World's Fair Pavilion, to advise him on the acoustics of the Chandigarh assembly halls.
Yes, and so it's got those metal panels all around, and I wonder if that must have come.
Right, which are sort of like abstracted clouds. Isn't that the idea?
Well, it has two sets. It has one set of square black panels all around, and then it has those abstracted clouds. So it has two levels of acoustic treatment.
I see. Right. So it's an interesting journey from the League of Nations design to the Chandigarh assembly. I don't spend a lot of time in the book on Chandigarh, but actually I think I that would be an interesting comparison to make, because in the early project in the League of Nations, Corbusier deliberately avoided any kind of electroacoustics. There were no microphone or loudspeakers. The building itself was a kind of loudspeaker, and it would project sound. At Chandigarh, it was completely electronically mediated. There would be a microphone at every seat, and there would be loudspeakers, and the entire kind of idea of the acoustic program was different.
Right. Well, Joseph, it's been a pleasure talking to you. And some of the point we'll also talk. He also designed an audio-visual training center in Chandigarh, which I think is also somehow connected to that. But maybe we'll pick that up in another conversation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.